Hi, I'm Jake, a park ranger here in the Blind Eternities. Over time, as we've discovered new planes and expanded our purview, like with all other things, we've gotten better at what we do. But because of that, and in a card game like Magic the Gathering, this expansion of the game naturally leads to a problem that I think every game has to deal with one way or another. And that problem is power creep. But I'm not an expert in that myself, so I reached out to a colleague of mine to get a slightly better picture of what it means to have a game be power crept and where that power creep comes from. Hi.
Hey, how's it going? Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So tell us a little bit about what you do.
Well, my name is Jake. I design Magic the Gathering cards. And I think before we talk about really what power creep is or where it's used, I think it's important that we talk about how we make the decision whether or not to power creep cards. And myself, I kind of listen to the two sides of my brain on whether any particular card or set should be power crept. So.
Look, at the end of the day, this is a business. We need to make more money to hit our revenue projections and make sure that we can continue to produce this game. The way we do that is to power creep the cards. We need something exciting that we can release and generate buzz about the new sets that are coming out. Encourage people to go out and tell their friends, bring new people into the game, and excite the player base that maybe hasn't played in a little while.
Cool. And,
hey, look, I don't care about all that finance stuff. My only interest is in playing the game. I want the game to be enjoyable for new players coming in and still feel exciting for somebody who's been playing for 2 decades. And that's why you need to make cards that are better than the cards that came before. Power creep, power creep, power creep. That's what I'm saying. We want cool cards. Make cooler cards.
Looks like we're power creeping another set. So whether you're a button mash hack and slash controller bash or a meeple moving mastermind of maps, mats, and minis, if you ruffle at the awful riffle shuffle scuffle, or if you're a click clack pick attack number ball luck sack, we're all here for the same reason.
I'm Jake. Let's talk games. So looking back at power creep, I think there's a tendency for people to reference some of the old bad cards, right? You talk Grey Ogre, you talk Dirkwood Boars, and then you look at the newer cards that have come out that are miles better than this. But I think we should take a different approach when we're talking about power creep, because even the people that played when Magic was first starting knew that a lot of those creatures were bad creatures. In fact, I think you saw a lower percentage on average of creatures in a deck in those older formats than you even do today. So if we're going to compare those, we can look at the bad creatures of yesteryear and compare them with the bad creatures of today. And I'll admit, they've been power crept a lot. You don't see 3-mana 2/2 with a drawback in modern Magic. But if you look at the good cards from the past and the good cards from the present, I don't think we see nearly as much movement. I think a lot of those cards, if you look at old school Magic, meaning all cards that were released in 1993 or 1994, and we look at the power level of the good cards, and I'm breaking out a lot of the stuff that's banned in every format, those feel like missteps and maybe not something that should be included in the discussion of power level, but it does represent a sort of upper bound on the game. If we talk about the maximum that a card could possibly ever do, we cannot print a better Black Lotus. We cannot print a better Ancestral Recall. Those are the ceilings. And so after those initial mistakes, starting over with a lower power level, and even as we start building back up, we know that we can't go above that line. We won't see a power crept dual land, although the triomes are an interesting lateral move from that. So when we talk about power creep, it's good to look at what was played back then, what is played now, and how that actually impacts the game. Because I think in a lot of ways, the power creep that we experience makes the game more complex, but not necessarily more powerful. So taking cards that have been power crept, cards that are noticeably better now than they were before, what analysis can we draw on the impact to the game at large? I think something we need to recognize is that cards weren't always designed to be as powerful as they possibly could be. A lot of cards that were made in the past were designed to be filler of sorts for limited environments, for draft, for sealed. So when you're building your deck, you have hard decisions to make. Do I want to play in several colors and play my best cards? Or do I want to play in one or two colors and use some cards that are kind of crummy? That design philosophy, I think, is what's been power crept. If we look at new packs and new sets, I did a draft of Thunder Junction recently, and the number of cards in the set that are actually bad is very small. I was finding useful cards on pick 12 and pick 13 in the draft, and I don't think that's something that I experienced in the past. I think that's something that's changed over time. A term that used to be used all the time was the vanilla test. And I think a lot of new players don't even know what that means. And not to mention, I don't think that metric is nearly as useful anymore. It used to be that any creature, the baseline, was power and toughness equal to the mana cost of that creature. And everything else was upside or downside that would balance off of that. So if you had 3 mana for a 2/2, but that 2/2 had flying and first strike, well, you're looking pretty good. Because it sort of passes the vanilla test, right? You have this creature that naturally would be a 3/3. And then you'd have other abilities that would take power and toughness points off of that as you add them to the card. Later on, the vanilla test changed a little bit. And it became that the baseline stats of a creature need to be at least the mana cost of that creature. So if you had a 3 mana 2/2, it didn't matter what abilities were on it, it didn't pass the vanilla test. And then it became, if it's a 3 mana 3/3 that does other things, it passes the vanilla test. Because, hey, at least the creature is useful on its own, and all of the abilities are just upside. You'll notice most of my discussion centers around creatures. And that's because, with regards to spells, I don't know that we've seen much power creep. We've seen a lot of words added to cards, a lot of complexity added to the way things resolve, but I don't know that that has necessarily made them more powerful. Counterspell, Dark Ritual, Lightning Bolt, all of these are baseline cards that have been printed at common and will never see play in standard again. I don't think that necessarily represents power creep. The reality is we probably won't see a better Lightning Bolt get printed. As new sets are released, be they standard sets or modern sets or commander sets, there seems to be a hard line drawn on a lot of these effects for how powerful they can possibly be. So, if we accept that power creep is a natural part of the game and something that is going to continue to happen over time, what can we do as players? Ultimately, not much. We can try to anticipate it and look forward to which effects persist over time. There are certain things that are good no matter what the rest of the metagame is. Being able to interact with your opponent's hand will always be good. Thoughtseize is an amazing card that has seen very little movement in a long, long time. Duress is still played in many places. There's a lot of styles of decks and different ways of playing the game that persist through power creep. So if you were looking to hold value on cards and concerned about that going down as new, better cards are printed, look to the effects that are kind of evergreen within the format. Things that even if they're reprinted are still necessary. This is why fetch lands and shock lands command such a high value. Because they are as close as you can get to those extremely powerful reserve list cards without going over. And if you really dislike power creep and want nothing to do with it, there's formats that exist outside of the new cards that are being released. Build a commander deck that uses only old bordered cards. the power level is surprisingly high on that. And you can build some amazing decks with that limited card pool and working in an ecosystem that doesn't have that issue of power creep. There's other formats like pre-modern and old school that use cards from specific time periods. And the decks within also come from a fixed card pool. And at that point, it becomes more of a collector game than a trading card game, just because there's only so many cards that you need to build the decks within those formats. And I think that's really fun and definitely appeals to a lot of people. I'm one of them. I like certain periods in Magic and being able to sit down and kind of take that moment to teleport back in time to when those decks were played is a very nostalgic feeling for me. And you might enjoy it even if you weren't playing when those sets were coming out, just because of the way that they work together and the different archetypes that cards have. I think are very different than what we see today, especially when it comes to certain counterspell and land destruction and discard strategies that I think is generally frowned upon by modern design kind of guidelines. So try out some new formats. Experiment with the new cards coming out, because there's definitely discoveries that can be made from that power creep, from those new cards that are being released that do things that have never been seen before. I myself am focused on looking at different time periods in Magic and trying to encapsulate what that means to play. I built a deck designed for in Commander to make the game feel like it did in the 90s. Turns on mana burn, limits the availability of artifact tokens and other ancillary game objects, limits what creatures can do and how you tap your lands to prevent some of the weird shenanigans of free spells and things of that nature. It uses Urlock as the commander. I have a video about it. It's a lot of fun. But just trying to encapsulate that style of gameplay, I think, is a really cool exercise in deck building and does a good job at showing what the game was like at different points in time. And even though we're dealing with power creep, and the game is a little bit different now, I don't know that that's a bad thing. I think that the beauty in Magic is that the game pieces are persistent, so you can always go back and you can always play with what used to exist. But you can also experience this massively diverse game with almost 50,000 cards released and every possible combination therein. You can have a really good time doing it. It's been nice talking to you.